The grand ballroom of palace sparkled with crystal chandeliers as Queen Elizabeth II prepared for one of the most important state dinners of her reign. Presidents, prime ministers, and dignitaries from around the world had gathered to celebrate a historic peace treaty. Everything had been planned to perfection, from the golden cutlery to the carefully selected menu that would please guests from dozens of different countries. The Queen, dressed in her finest evening gown and wearing the imperial state crown, walked gracefully down the marble staircase. Her corgis, as usual, followed close behind despite the protests of her staff, who insisted the dogs should remain in their quarters during such formal occasions. But Elizabeth had always been stubborn about her beloved pets, and tonight would be no different. As the royal family took their positions in the receiving line, Prince Philip whispered something amusing in his wife's ear that made her suppress a smile. The Duke of Edinburgh had a reputation for his quick wit and sometimes inappropriate comments, but tonight he seemed to be on his best behavior. Prince Charles stood nearby, adjusting his bow tie nervously as he always did before meeting foreign dignitaries, while Princess Anne chatted quietly with her mother about the evening's protocol. The first guests began arriving in their magnificent carriages, each announcement echoing through the palace halls. The President of France stepped out of his vehicle with his wife, both dressed impeccably for the occasion. Behind them came the Chancellor of Germany, followed by the Prime Minister of Japan and dozens of other world leaders who had traveled thousands of miles for this momentous evening. Everything proceeded smoothly until the president of a small African nation arrived with his entourage. As he stepped forward to greet the Queen, his traditional ceremonial robes caught the attention of her corgis. The dogs had never seen such colorful, flowing fabric before, and they became instantly fascinated. While the Queen attempted to maintain her composure during the formal introduction, her pets began circling the distinguished guest like sharks around their prey. The president, completely unaware of the canine interest in his attire, continued speaking with the Queen about trade agreements and diplomatic relations. Meanwhile, one particularly bold corgi named Whiskey decided that the golden tassels hanging from the president's robes looked remarkably similar to the rope toys he played with in the palace gardens. Without warning, the dog lunged forward and grabbed one of the tassels in his teeth. What happened next would be remembered in palace circles for decades to come. As Whiskey pulled on the tassel, the entire ceremonial robe began to unravel like a poorly knitted sweater. The president, still engaged in serious conversation with the Queen, remained completely oblivious to the fact that his traditional garments were slowly but surely falling apart behind him. Prince Philip, who had noticed the situation developing, tried to discreetly signal to his wife while maintaining his diplomatic smile. The Queen, trained from childhood to remain composed in any situation, continued nodding and responding appropriately to the president's comments about agricultural exports, even as she watched her corgi systematically destroy a priceless piece of cultural heritage. The other members of the royal family began to notice the unfolding disaster. Princess Anne attempted to call the dogs away with subtle hand gestures, but the corgis were far too interested in their new game to pay attention to human commands. Prince Charles, realizing that international relations might suffer if the situation continued, took a step forward as if to intervene, but his mother's barely perceptible headshake stopped him in his tracks. By now, several other guests had noticed what was happening and were struggling to maintain their diplomatic composure. The German chancellor developed a sudden coughing fit that sounded suspiciously like suppressed laughter, while the French president's wife buried her face in her hands, supposedly to adjust her jewelry, but actually to hide her expression. The palace photographer, who had been positioned to capture the historic meeting between world leaders, found himself documenting what would surely become one of the most unusual diplomatic incidents in royal history. His camera clicked rapidly as he tried to decide whether these images would ever see the light of day or would be locked away in the palace archives forever. Just when it seemed the situation couldn't become more complicated, two more corgis decided to join the fun. Sugar and Honey, attracted by the commotion, abandoned their usual posts by the Queen's side and bounded over to help their brother Whiskey with his interesting new project. Soon all three dogs were pulling on different parts of the president's increasingly fragile ceremonial outfit. The president's aide, who had been standing respectfully in the background, finally noticed what was happening to his leader's traditional robes. His eyes widened in horror as he realized that centuries of cultural tradition were literally unraveling before his eyes. He began moving forward to intervene, but the strict protocol of royal meetings meant he couldn't simply rush in and rescue his president without potentially causing an international incident. Meanwhile, the Queen found herself in perhaps the most diplomatically delicate situation of her entire reign. She couldn't simply tell her dogs to stop without drawing attention to what they were doing, which might embarrass her distinguished guest. She couldn't ignore the situation entirely, as the president was likely to notice eventually that his clothing was disappearing piece by piece. And she certainly couldn't let the situation continue indefinitely, as there was a very real possibility that her corgis might succeed in completely disrobing a head of state in front of dozens of world leaders and members of the international press. The solution, when it came, was both elegant and typically royal in its execution. The Queen simply stepped slightly to her left, positioning herself so that her own elaborate gown blocked most of the other guests' view of the ongoing canine mischief. At the same time, she smoothly transitioned the conversation with the president toward the topic of the evening's dinner menu, suggesting they might continue their discussion inside where it would be more comfortable. As they moved toward the palace entrance, Prince Philip discreetly positioned himself on the president's other side, effectively creating a royal escort that shielded the increasingly disheveled leader from the curious eyes of other guests. The corgis, finding their game suddenly less interesting now that their target was moving, gradually lost interest and wandered off to investigate the fascinating smells emanating from the palace kitchens. The president never did realize exactly what had happened to his ceremonial robes that evening. His aide later told him that the garments had been damaged during transport and quickly arranged for a replacement outfit to be brought from the embassy. The official photographs from the evening showed only the formal greetings and handshakes, with the canine adventure carefully edited out of royal history. However, the story quickly became legend among palace staff and members of the royal family. Prince Philip, in particular, delighted in retelling the tale at family gatherings, always adding new embellishments about the dog's expressions and the increasingly creative ways they had found to dismantle traditional African craftsmanship. The Queen, while she never publicly acknowledged the incident, was spotted smiling mysteriously whenever anyone mentioned that particular state dinner. Years later, when the president visited Britain again, he brought a special gift for the Queen, a beautiful corgi toy designed to look exactly like traditional ceremonial robes, complete with golden tassels that were specifically designed to be pulled and tugged without falling apart. The Queen accepted the gift graciously, and observant guests noted that her corgis seemed particularly interested in their new plaything. The evening had taught everyone an important lesson about the unpredictable nature of royal life, where centuries of tradition and protocol could be upended in an instant by the simple curiosity of three small dogs who had never learned the difference between a rope toy and a priceless cultural artifact. Prince Charles had always taken his duties as the heir to the throne seriously, perhaps too seriously according to some members of his family. His passion for organic farming, environmental conservation, and architectural preservation sometimes led him into situations that were far removed from the dignified image most people expected from a future king. Such was the case on a particularly memorable morning, when he decided to visit a local farm to learn more about sustainable agriculture practices. The prince arrived at farm dressed in his finest country attire, perfectly pressed tweed jacket, polished riding boots, and a flat cap that had been specially made by London's most exclusive hatter. His security team had cleared the area thoroughly, and local officials had been briefed on the proper protocol for greeting a member of the royal family. Everything was arranged for a peaceful, educational morning that would demonstrate the prince's commitment to environmental issues. Henderson, the farm's owner, had been preparing for weeks for this royal visit. She had cleaned every barn, painted every fence, and rehearsed her presentation about organic farming techniques until she could recite it perfectly. Was a practical woman who had been working the land for over 30 years, but the prospect of entertaining royalty had made her more nervous than she cared to admit. The tour began in the vegetable gardens, where Prince Charles displayed his considerable knowledge about soil composition and crop rotation. He asked intelligent questions about composting techniques and nodded approvingly when explained her methods for controlling pests without using chemical pesticides. The prince's genuine interest in farming surprised, who had expected a polite but superficial visit from someone who had never worked with his hands. Everything proceeded smoothly until they reached the pig enclosure. Had been particularly proud of her prize-winning sows, massive creatures that had earned ribbons at county fairs throughout the region. She had spent extra time grooming them for the royal visit, though she knew that pigs could never truly be considered clean in the conventional sense. Still, they were magnificent examples of their breed, and she was eager to show them off. Prince Charles approached the fence with enthusiasm, eager to learn about pig breeding and management. He had read extensively about the intelligence of pigs and their important role in sustainable farming systems. What he had not anticipated was the reaction of Beatrice's largest and most temperamental sow, to the presence of a royal visitor. Beatrice was a formidable creature, weighing nearly 400 pounds and possessing a personality that often described as spirited. The sow had never seen anyone dressed quite like Prince Charles, and she became immediately fascinated by his appearance. Something about the combination of his tweed jacket, shiny boots, and the way he gestured while speaking captured her attention completely. As the prince leaned against the fence to get a better look at the pigs, Beatrice approached with what seemed like friendly curiosity, began explaining the sow's lineage and breeding history, while Prince Charles listened attentively and occasionally reached out to pat Beatrice's enormous head. The pig appeared to enjoy the attention and made contented grunting sounds that interpreted as approval. The situation began to change when Prince Charles decided to climb over the fence to get a closer look at the pig enclosure. Despite protests that it really wasn't necessary, the prince insisted that he wanted to experience pig farming from the inside, so to speak. His security team exchanged worried glances, but knew better than to argue with their charge when he had made up his mind about something. Once inside the enclosure, Prince Charles found himself surrounded by several large pigs, all of whom seemed surprisingly interested in their visitor. Beatrice, in particular, appeared to be studying the prince's outfit with the intensity of a fashion critic evaluating a new designer's collection. She sniffed at his boots, investigated his jacket pockets, and seemed particularly fascinated by the silver buttons that adorned his waistcoat. What happened next would be debated by witnesses for years afterward. Some claimed that Beatrice was simply being playful, while others insisted that the sow had developed an inexplicable romantic attachment to the prince. Whatever her motivation, Beatrice suddenly decided that Prince Charles needed to stay in her enclosure permanently, and she began to take steps to ensure that he wouldn't leave. The first sign of trouble came when Beatrice positioned herself directly behind the prince and began pushing him away from the fence. Prince Charles, assuming this was simply friendly pig behavior, tried to step around her while continuing his conversation about feeding schedules and veterinary care. But every time he moved toward the fence, Beatrice moved to block his path, grunting in what sounded like disapproval. Initially found the situation amusing and assured the prince that Beatrice was just being friendly. However, as the sow's behavior became more insistent, and she began using her considerable weight to physically prevent the prince from leaving the enclosure, began to realize that they might have a problem on their hands. The situation escalated rapidly when Prince Charles tried to climb back over the fence. Beatrice, apparently interpreting this as an attempt at abandonment, grabbed the bottom of his tweed jacket in her teeth and began pulling him back toward the center of the enclosure. The prince, who had never encountered such determined resistance from a farm animal, found himself engaged in a gentle but persistent tug-of-war with a 400-pound pig. His security team immediately went into high alert, hands moving toward their weapons as they tried to assess whether the future King of England was actually under attack from a lovesick sow. However, their training had never included protocols for rescuing royalty from amorous livestock, and they were uncertain how to proceed without either harming the pig or potentially escalating the situation. Meanwhile was experiencing every farmer's worst nightmare. Her prize-winning pig was essentially holding a member of the royal family hostage. She tried calling to Beatrice in her most authoritative voice, but the sow was far too focused on her new friend to pay attention to mere human commands. The pig had apparently decided that Prince Charles was the most interesting thing that had ever visited her enclosure, and she had no intention of letting him leave. The prince himself, despite being trapped by a pig, maintained his characteristic composure. He continued trying to reason with Beatrice in the sort of polite, diplomatic tone he might use when addressing a difficult foreign dignitary. He explained to the pig that while he had very much enjoyed meeting her, he did have other appointments that day and really needed to continue his tour of the farm. Beatrice, for her part, seemed to interpret the prince's calm voice as encouragement. She released his jacket long enough to position herself more comfortably between him and the fence, then sat down with a satisfied grunt that suggested she was prepared to maintain her vigil indefinitely. The standoff continued for nearly 20 minutes, with trying increasingly desperate tactics to distract her pig, while the prince's security team debated the wisdom of calling for backup. The solution, when it finally came, was as unexpected as the problem itself. Prince William, who had been scheduled to join his father for the latter part of the farm visit, arrived earlier than expected and immediately assessed the situation. Unlike the adults, who were paralyzed by the unprecedented nature of the crisis, William simply walked over to a nearby feed bucket, grabbed a handful of pig treats, and began shaking them loudly while calling to Beatrice. The sow's head snapped up at the sound, and she immediately recognized the possibility of food rewards. Her romantic attachment to Prince Charles, while intense, proved to be no match for her more basic pig instincts. She reluctantly moved away from the prince and trotted over to investigate William's offerings, allowing her royal captive to finally escape from the enclosure. Prince Charles emerged from his adventure with his dignity intact, but his clothing somewhat the worse for wear. His tweed jacket bore clear evidence of pig teeth marks, his boots were covered in mud, and his perfectly styled hair had been thoroughly disheveled by Beatrice's enthusiastic attention. However, he maintained his good humor throughout the ordeal, and even insisted on thanking Beatrice personally for her hospitality before leaving the enclosure. The incident became known in royal circles as the Pig Affair, and Prince Charles later claimed it had given him valuable insights into animal behavior and the challenges faced by modern farmers. He continued to visit farms throughout his environmental advocacy work, though he made a point of staying on the human side of pig enclosures during subsequent visits. Henderson, meanwhile, found herself dealing with unexpected celebrity when Beatrice's romantic adventure made headlines in agricultural publications across the country. The sow, apparently unaware of her newfound fame, returned to her normal routine of eating, sleeping, and generally terrorizing the other pigs in her enclosure. However, noted that Beatrice seemed to pay special attention whenever visitors wore tweed jackets, as if hopping for another royal encounter. Princess Anne had earned a reputation as the most practical and no-nonsense member of the royal family. Unlike her brothers, who sometimes seemed overwhelmed by the ceremonial aspects of royal duty, Anne approached her obligations with military precision and a refreshing lack of pretension. She preferred horses to people, action to speeches, and honest work to ribbon-cutting ceremonies. This attitude had served her well throughout her life, but it would lead to one of the most memorable diplomatic incidents in royal history. Trouble began when Princess Anne was invited to visit the newly opened British Cultural Center in a prominent European capital. The invitation had come from the British ambassador, who was eager to showcase the facility to a senior member of the royal family and generate positive publicity for British cultural exports. The princess had initially been reluctant to accept, as she found such events tedious, but her mother had insisted that someone from the family needed to make an appearance. The cultural center was the ambassador's pride and joy, a gleaming modern building filled with the finest examples of British art, literature, and cultural achievements. Every detail had been carefully planned to impress visitors with Britain's rich heritage and contemporary relevance. The ambassador himself, Sir Reginald, was a career diplomat who had spent decades perfecting the art of international relations and had never encountered a situation he couldn't handle with proper protocol and refined conversation. Princess Anne arrived at the cultural center on schedule, dressed in a sensible navy blue suit that was appropriate for the occasion without being overly formal. She was accompanied by her usual small entourage, a lady-in-waiting, a private secretary, and 2 protection officers who tried to blend into the background while maintaining constant vigilance. The ambassador greeted her with practiced diplomatic enthusiasm and launched into what he clearly expected to be a routine tour of British cultural excellence. The first stop was the literature section, where rare manuscripts and first editions were displayed in climate-controlled cases. Sir Reginald began an elaborate presentation about the importance of preserving British literary heritage, complete with detailed explanations about humidity levels and conservation techniques. Princess Anne listened politely for several minutes before interrupting to ask practical questions about the cost of the facility and whether anyone actually used it for its intended purpose. Her directness caught the ambassador off guard, but he recovered quickly and assured her that the center was extremely well utilized by local citizens who were eager to learn more about British culture. He then led her to the art gallery, where paintings by famous British artists hung in carefully lit displays that had been arranged by London's most prestigious curators. The art tour proceeded smoothly until they reached a particularly avant-garde section featuring contemporary British sculptures. One piece in particular caught Princess Anne's attention, a large, abstract metal sculpture that the artist had titled Industrial Evolution. The work consisted of twisted steel beams arranged in what the artist claimed represented the transformation of British industry from the Industrial Revolution to the modern technological age. Sir Reginald began an enthusiastic explanation of the piece's symbolism and cultural significance, quoting extensively from the artist's statement and various art critics who had praised the work's bold vision. Princess Anne studied the sculpture with the practical eye of someone who had spent years around horses and farm equipment, and her assessment was characteristically blunt. "It looks like someone crashed a tractor into a greenhouse," she observed matter-of-factly. The ambassador paused mid-sentence, uncertain how to respond to such an unvarnished critique of what was supposed to be a masterpiece of contemporary British art. The small group of local dignitaries who had gathered for the tour exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether the princess was making a sophisticated artistic observation or simply expressing her honest opinion about modern sculpture. Before Sir Reginald could formulate a diplomatic response, Princess Anne decided to investigate the sculpture more closely. She walked around the piece, examining it from various angles with the sort of thorough attention she usually reserved for evaluating horses. The sculpture, which had been installed just days before her visit, began to make ominous creaking sounds as she approached. "Is this thing properly secured?" she asked, reaching out to test the stability of one of the steel beams. The ambassador assured her that the installation had been professionally mounted by experts and was perfectly safe for public display. However, his confidence was somewhat undermined when Princess Anne's gentle push caused the entire sculpture to sway alarmingly. The creaking sounds grew louder, and several small pieces of metal that had been welded to the main structure began to rattle ominously. What happened next would be debated by art critics and royal watchers for years to come. Princess Anne, applying the sort of practical problem-solving approach that had served her well in countless other situations, decided to test the sculpture's structural integrity more thoroughly. She grasped one of the protruding steel beams and gave it what she later described as a proper shake to see if it was sound. The sculpture was not sound. With a grinding shriek that echoed throughout the gallery, the entire Industrial Evolution installation began to collapse. Steel beams twisted and separated from their moorings. Welded joints failed under stress they had never been designed to bear, and various decorative elements that had been attached to the main structure went flying in all directions. Princess Anne stepped back quickly as the sculpture transformed from a symbol of British industrial progress into a very real demonstration of structural failure. The collapse took nearly 30 seconds to complete, during which time the ambassador stood frozen in horror while his carefully planned cultural showcase literally fell apart before his eyes. Gallery visitors screamed and fled as chunks of metal crashed to the floor, and Princess Anne's protection officers immediately moved to shield her from any flying debris, though she seemed more fascinated than frightened by the unfolding disaster. When the dust finally settled, the remains of Industrial Evolution lay scattered across the gallery floor in a twisted heap that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to an actual industrial accident. The carefully polished floors were scratched and dented. Several other artworks had been damaged by flying metal fragments, and a section of the gallery's expensive lighting system had been destroyed when a particularly large beam fell into it. Sir Reginald stared at the wreckage in stunned silence, his diplomatic training having failed to prepare him for a situation where a member of the royal family had accidentally destroyed a major art installation during what was supposed to be a routine cultural visit. The local dignitaries whispered among themselves in their native language, and Princess Anne suspected they were not discussing the finer points of contemporary British sculpture. The princess herself seemed remarkably unperturbed by the chaos she had inadvertently caused. She examined the wreckage with the same practical interest she had shown the intact sculpture, occasionally nudging pieces with her foot to get a better look at the construction methods that had proved so inadequate. "Well," she finally announced to the stunned gathering, "I suppose that confirms my original assessment. Shoddy workmanship, if you ask me." The ambassador's attempts to salvage the situation involved a great deal of apologetic discussion about insurance coverage and promises to contact the artist immediately to arrange for repairs or replacement. However, Princess Anne had already moved on to examine other pieces in the collection, leaving the diplomatic staff to deal with the practical consequences of her artistic critique. The local newspaper coverage of the incident was surprisingly positive, with several art critics agreeing that the sculpture's structural failure raised important questions about the quality of contemporary British craftsmanship. The artist himself claimed that the collapse had been an unintended but brilliant extension of his original vision, transforming the piece from a static representation of industrial evolution into a dynamic demonstration of entropy and decay. Princess Anne's response to the media attention was characteristically direct. When asked by reporters about the incident, she simply stated that she believed art should be built to last, just like everything else, and that people who couldn't construct a proper sculpture probably shouldn't be representing British culture abroad. Her comments sparked a heated debate in artistic circles about the relationship between form and function in contemporary art. The British Cultural Centre eventually reopened with a new sculpture in place of Industrial Evolution, though the replacement piece was significantly smaller and had been subjected to much more rigorous structural testing before installation. The ambassador, meanwhile, learned to include detailed engineering assessments in his preparations for future royal visits and developed a new appreciation for the practical challenges of combining art with diplomacy. The incident became known in diplomatic circles as the day Princess Anne defeated modern art, and it reinforced her reputation as someone who could find the weak point in any situation, whether it involved international relations, horse breeding, or allegedly cutting-edge cultural installations. The princess herself seemed to consider the whole affair a useful reminder that appearances could be deceiving and that proper engineering principles applied to everything, including contemporary sculpture. Years later, when asked about the incident during a charity fundraising event, Princess Anne simply smiled and observed that she had probably done the art world a favor by exposing poor workmanship before someone got hurt. She then returned to her more important work with various charitable organizations, leaving others to debate the finer points of artistic expression and structural integrity. Prince William had always been considered the most technologically savvy member of the royal family, comfortable with modern gadgets and social media in ways that sometimes baffled his older relatives. His ability to navigate the digital world had made him a valuable asset during royal engagements, where he could connect with younger audiences and demonstrate the monarchy's relevance in the 21st century. However, this technological confidence would lead him into one of the most embarrassing situations of his royal career. The trouble began when William agreed to participate in a live television interview to promote a new charity initiative focused on mental health awareness among young people. The interview was scheduled to take place via video call, a format that had become increasingly common during the pandemic and seemed like a natural fit for the tech-friendly prince. What could possibly go wrong with a simple video chat from the comfort of his own home? The production team had sent detailed technical instructions to Kensington Palace staff weeks in advance, covering everything from camera angles to lighting requirements. Palace IT specialists had tested all the equipment multiple times and confirmed that everything was working perfectly. The interview was set to be broadcast live on prime-time television, reaching millions of viewers across the United Kingdom and potentially around the world. William had prepared thoroughly for the interview, reviewing talking points about the importance of mental health support and memorizing statistics about youth counseling services. He was passionate about the cause and eager to use his platform to raise awareness about issues that too often remained hidden behind closed doors. The interview represented an opportunity to reach young people who might be struggling and let them know that help was available. On the morning of the broadcast, everything seemed to be proceeding according to plan. William had dressed appropriately in a crisp shirt and tie, his hair was perfectly styled, and he had positioned himself in his study with carefully chosen books and family photos visible in the background. The lighting was professional quality, the audio was crystal clear, and the technology was functioning flawlessly during final tests. The interview began exactly on schedule, with the television host introducing the segment and explaining the importance of the mental health initiative that Prince William was supporting. The prince appeared on screen looking polished and professional as he began discussing the challenges faced by young people dealing with anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues. For the first 10 minutes, everything proceeded smoothly. William spoke eloquently about breaking down stigma surrounding mental health and emphasized the importance of creating safe spaces where young people could seek help without fear of judgment. His genuine passion for the subject matter came through clearly, and the production team was pleased with how well the interview was progressing. The problems began when William decided to demonstrate a new mental health app that his foundation was promoting. The app was designed to provide immediate support and resources for young people experiencing crisis situations, and William wanted to show viewers how easy it was to access help using their smartphones. He had practiced this demonstration several times with Palace staff, and was confident it would be a powerful moment in the interview. However, when William held up his phone to show the app to the camera, something unexpected happened. Instead of displaying the mental health resources he intended to showcase, his phone screen showed his personal text messages, which had somehow opened when he lifted the device. The messages were clearly visible to the television cameras and, by extension, to millions of viewers watching the live broadcast. The text conversation that appeared on screen was between William and his wife, and while it wasn't scandalous or inappropriate, it was decidedly domestic and personal in nature. The messages revealed a discussion about grocery shopping, concerns about their children's homework assignments, and a debate over whether they had remembered to record a television program they wanted to watch together. One message from Reed: "Did you remember to pick up milk? And Harry called about Sunday lunch. I told him we'd have to check with you first because you always complain when we don't plan properly." William's response was visible below. "Forgot the milk again. We'll grab it after this interview if I don't completely embarrass myself on live television. Why does Harry always wait until the last minute with these things?" The television host, realizing that something had gone wrong but uncertain exactly what viewers were seeing, tried to continue with the interview while William frantically attempted to close his text messages and navigate back to the mental health app. Unfortunately, his increasingly frantic finger tapping only made the situation worse, as he accidentally opened more applications and revealed additional personal information. His photo gallery briefly flashed on screen, showing dozens of casual family pictures including several shots of him in pajamas playing with his children, a selfie he had taken while brushing his teeth, and numerous photos of the family dog in various amusing poses. His music playlist also became visible, revealing a somewhat embarrassing collection of pop songs, show tunes, and what appeared to be several audio files labeled "relaxation sounds for better sleep." Meanwhile, the live television broadcast continued relentlessly, with millions of viewers getting an unprecedented glimpse into the private digital life of a future king. Social media immediately exploded with screenshots and commentary about the prince's text messages, his taste in music, and the surprisingly ordinary nature of his family communications. The television host, demonstrating remarkable professionalism under pressure, attempted to salvage the situation by asking William about the importance of maintaining work-life balance while dealing with mental health challenges. However, the prince was clearly distracted by his ongoing battle with his malfunctioning phone and kept glancing down at the device while trying to maintain his composure. The situation reached its peak of absurdity when William's phone began playing music at full volume, apparently triggered by his desperate attempts to close various applications. The song that emerged from his device was "Let It Go" from the Disney movie Frozen, which he had evidently downloaded for his daughter's entertainment. The uplifting anthem about embracing one's true self provided an ironically appropriate soundtrack to William's very public technological meltdown. As powerful vocals filled the television studio, William finally admitted defeat and simply turned his phone face down on his desk, effectively ending his demonstration of 21st-century mental health resources. The host, who had been struggling to maintain professional decorum throughout the ordeal, couldn't suppress a slight smile as she transitioned to discussing more traditional forms of mental health support. The remainder of the interview proceeded without further technical incidents, though William seemed somewhat rattled by his digital disaster. He managed to recover his composure and delivered several thoughtful responses about the importance of reducing stigma around mental health issues, but viewers noted that he kept glancing nervously at his silenced phone as if expecting it to cause further embarrassment. Social media reaction to the interview was swift and largely sympathetic, with many people commenting that William's technological struggles made him seem more relatable and human. The hashtag #LetItGoWilliam began trending within hours of the broadcast, and memes featuring the prince's confused expressions during his phone malfunction spread across various platforms. Mental health advocates praised William for his willingness to continue the interview despite his obvious embarrassment, arguing that his vulnerability in the moment actually reinforced the message that everyone struggles with challenges and that seeking help should never be a source of shame. The incident became an unexpected teaching moment about resilience and the importance of maintaining perspective when things don't go according to plan. Later revealed in a follow-up interview that she had found the whole situation amusing rather than embarrassing, and that the family had watched replays of the broadcast together while laughing about William's technological misadventures. She also confirmed that he had indeed forgot to buy milk again after the interview, a detail that social media users found particularly endearing. The mental health app that William had been trying to demonstrate actually experienced a significant spike in downloads following the interview, as people became curious about the resource that had been overshadowed by his phone troubles. The charity initiative raised more money in the week following the broadcast than it had in the previous month, suggesting that William's genuine humanity had been more effective than any polished presentation could have been. Palace IT specialists quietly implemented new protocols for future video interviews, including multiple backup devices and demonstration procedures that were less likely to result in accidental disclosure of personal information. However, William himself seemed to take the incident in stride, joking in subsequent appearances about the unpredictable nature of modern technology and the importance of having a sense of humor about life's unexpected moments. The frozen phone incident, as it came to be known in royal circles, ultimately became one of the most humanizing moments in William's public life, demonstrating that even future monarchs struggle with the same everyday technology challenges that face millions of ordinary people. It also proved that sometimes the most effective way to connect with an audience is simply to be authentically yourself, technological disasters and all. Prince Harry had always been known as the rebellious member of the royal family, the one most likely to break protocol and challenge traditional expectations. His military service had given him a practical, straightforward approach to problem-solving that sometimes clashed with the elaborate ceremonies and formal procedures that defined royal life. This tension between military efficiency and royal tradition would create one of the most memorable diplomatic incidents in recent royal history. The occasion was a state visit from the president of a small but strategically important nation in the Pacific. The visit had been planned with meticulous attention to detail, involving months of coordination between diplomatic staff, security services, and palace protocol experts. Every aspect of the president's three-day stay had been choreographed to demonstrate Britain's respect for the visiting nation while showcasing the best of British hospitality and tradition. Prince Harry's role in the proceedings was relatively minor but symbolically important. He was scheduled to represent the younger generation of the royal family at a formal dinner honoring the visiting president and his delegation. The dinner was to be held in one of Windsor Castle's most impressive dining halls, with a menu featuring both British delicacies and dishes from the president's homeland, prepared by renowned chefs who had been planning the meal for weeks. The trouble began during the pre-dinner reception, where guests mingled in the castle's grand drawing room while enjoying cocktails and Harry, dressed in his formal military dress uniform complete with medals and ceremonial sword, was engaged in polite conversation with various members of the visiting delegation when he noticed something that his military training had taught him to recognize immediately: a security vulnerability. During his years of active military service, Harry had developed an instinctive awareness of potential threats and security gaps that might be overlooked by others. As he surveyed the reception room, he noticed that one of the large medieval tapestries hanging on the wall appeared to be moving slightly, as if disturbed by air currents from behind. Given the castle's age and construction, this wouldn't normally be cause for concern, but Harry's trained eye detected something unusual about the movement pattern. The tapestry in question was a priceless 15th-century work depicting scenes from British military history, hanging in a location that provided a perfect vantage point over the reception area where the visiting president and other dignitaries were gathered. If someone had managed to position themselves behind the tapestry, they would have an ideal position for surveillance, or worse, for launching some kind of attack on the assembled guests. Harry's military instincts took over, overriding the diplomatic protocols that should have governed his behavior at such a formal gathering. Without alerting security or consulting with palace staff, he decided to investigate the situation personally. After all, his training had taught him that in potential threat situations, every second counted, and the time it would take to go through proper channels might be time that attackers could use to carry out their plans. Moving casually through the reception crowd so as not to alarm the guests, Harry made his way toward the suspicious tapestry. His plan was simple: determine whether someone was actually hiding behind the ancient artwork, and if so, apprehend them before they could pose a threat to the visiting dignitaries. What he hadn't considered was the possibility that his military-style response might be somewhat inappropriate for a formal diplomatic reception. As Harry approached the tapestry, he could hear what sounded like muffled movements from behind the heavy fabric. This confirmed his suspicions that someone was indeed concealed in the space between the tapestry and the wall. Drawing on his special forces training, he positioned himself to one side of the hanging artwork and prepared to surprise whoever was lurking behind it. With a swift, practiced movement, Harry grabbed the edge of the tapestry and yanked it aside, ready to confront the intruder and neutralize any potential threat. What he found behind the priceless medieval artwork was not a terrorist or spy, but rather two members of the palace catering staff who had been using the hidden space behind the tapestry as a shortcut between the kitchen and the serving areas. The staff members, who had been quietly transporting additional through what they considered a convenient and discreet passage, were just as surprised to see Prince Harry as he was to find them. Unfortunately, their surprise caused them to drop the silver platters they had been carrying, sending dozens of carefully prepared flying through the air and crashing to the floor in a cascade of smoked salmon, caviar, and delicate pastry. The sound of the crashing platters and Harry's dramatic reveal of the tapestry caused an immediate stir among the reception guests. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as distinguished diplomats and visiting dignitaries turned to see what had caused the commotion. What they witnessed was Prince Harry, sword at his side and military decorations gleaming, standing amid a pile of scattered appetizers while two bewildered catering staff members crouched behind a medieval tapestry. The visiting president, who had been engaged in serious discussion about trade agreements with the British Foreign Secretary, looked over to see a member of the royal family apparently conducting some kind of military operation against the palace's own catering staff. His security detail immediately went on high alert, uncertain whether they were witnessing a legitimate security response or some bizarre British custom they hadn't been briefed about. Palace staff who witnessed the incident were frozen with uncertainty about how to respond. On one hand, Prince Harry was clearly acting on what he believed were legitimate security concerns. On the other hand, he had just disrupted a formal diplomatic reception by attacking a priceless tapestry and causing the palace catering staff to shower expensive across a room full of international dignitaries. The situation became even more complicated when Harry, realizing that he had made a significant error in judgment, attempted to help the catering staff clean up the scattered food while still wearing his formal military dress uniform. His ceremonial sword, which was designed for parade display rather than practical use, kept getting tangled in the tapestry fabric as he tried to assist with the cleanup operation. Meanwhile, the palace protocol officers were frantically trying to determine how to explain the situation to the confused diplomatic guests without creating an international incident. The official line they eventually settled on was that Prince Harry had been conducting a routine security check, though this explanation seemed to raise more questions than it answered among the visiting delegation. The Foreign Secretary, demonstrating the sort of quick thinking that had made him successful in international negotiations, smoothly transitioned the conversation back to trade discussions, while palace staff discreetly cleaned up the food debris and repositioned the tapestry. However, the visiting president continued to glance occasionally in Harry's direction, clearly puzzled by what he had witnessed. The formal dinner that followed proceeded without further incident, though Harry noticed that several members of the visiting delegation seemed to be studying him with particular interest throughout the meal. The president himself maintained perfect diplomatic courtesy, but appeared to be suppressing amusement whenever he looked in Harry's direction, suggesting that he had found the tapestry incident more entertaining than threatening. The story quickly spread through diplomatic circles, where it became known as the Great Tapestry Raid. Foreign ministry officials who heard the tale were divided between admiration for Harry's security consciousness and bewilderment at his approach to formal protocol. Some praised his military vigilance, while others questioned whether special forces tactics were appropriate responses to suspicious tapestry movements during diplomatic receptions. Harry himself seemed to take the incident in stride, later joking with military colleagues about the challenges of transitioning from active combat zones to formal palace receptions. He noted that while his military training had served him well in Afghanistan, it perhaps needed some modification for dealing with catering staff shortcuts and medieval artwork. The palace catering department, meanwhile, implemented new protocols for moving supplies during formal events, establishing proper corridors that didn't involve hiding behind priceless historical artifacts. The staff members involved in the incident reportedly found the experience amusing once they recovered from their initial shock, and they occasionally joked about being the only palace employees ever to be tactically apprehended by a member of the royal family. Years later, when the visiting president returned for another state visit, he made a point of complimenting the palace's security arrangements, and specifically mentioned his confidence in the royal family's commitment to guest safety. Palace staff noted that he seemed to pay particular attention to the tapestries during his tour, though whether this was from genuine interest in medieval art or lingering curiosity about British security procedures remained unclear. The incident ultimately became part of royal family lore, a reminder that military training and diplomatic protocol don't always mix seamlessly, and that even the best intentions can sometimes lead to unexpectedly dramatic results. Harry's willingness to take action when he perceived a threat was admirable, even if his assessment of the situation proved to be somewhat overzealous. The story also highlighted the challenges faced by veterans transitioning from military service to civilian roles, even when those roles happen to involve representing the British monarchy at formal diplomatic gatherings. The tapestry itself survived the incident unharmed and continued to hang in its traditional location, though palace staff reported that guests sometimes seemed particularly interested in examining it closely, as if expecting to find hidden passages or concealed catering staff lurking behind the medieval artwork.